So today, we are talking about something really interesting, the Han Dynasty in China and the Roman Empire. Two superpowers, roughly the same time, both collapsed. But here is the crazy part. If you look at what happened next, the story is almost identical. Warlords everywhere, constant fighting, barbarians moving in and taking over. But the ending of the stories could not be more different. China collapsed, stayed divided for about 400 years, and then reunified together. Rome collapsed and never really came back again. So here, I'm not going too deep into the reasons. I'll cover that in another video maybe. We're just gonna walk through the timeline, kind of piece it together step by step and figure out where exactly things started to go differently. Just like the title says, same chaos, different ending. Logic and facts, East meets West. I'm Zhuge. Let's dive in. We can start the story in the late 2nd century. On the Chinese side, Han Dynasty, there was Emperor Ling. This guy wasn't really in control of the government, relied heavily on two groups around him, and the eunuchs and the powerful court relatives, or we can see as imperial in-laws. He wanted to balance the power of the aristocracy with them. But both groups just kept getting bigger and stronger, and neither side would back down. Eventually, the court started fighting itself. In 189 AD, Emperor Ling dies and everything falls apart immediately. The leading figure of the imperial in-laws, He Jin, decides he's going to wipe out all of the eunuchs. So he makes one critical move. He invites a regional general, Dong Zhuo, into the capital. And from there, things spiral. He Jin gets killed by the eunuchs. His subordinates, the nobles led by Yuan Shao, turn around and massacre the eunuchs. Then Dong Zhuo marches in and takes control of the emperor. And right after that, you get all these generals, Yuan Shao, Cao Cao, Yuan Shu, Sun Jian, Liu Bei, they're all fighting Dong Zhuo as well as grabbing territory for themselves. It's basically Game of Thrones. That chaos goes on for about 20 years, and eventually you get three major states, Cao Wei, Shu Han, Eastern Wu. That's the famous Three Kingdoms period. Now let's look at Rome. Around the same time, there was an emperor, Commodius, and honestly, same kind of situation. He didn't really govern. He was busy putting on performance, literally fighting in the arena, treating being emperor like being a celebrity. So what happens? 192 AD, he gets assassinated. And here's where things get interesting. For the next few decades, Rome enters this completely insane phase. Armies started proclaiming their own emperors. If you had troops, you could claim the throne. 1 year, one emperor. Next year, someone else. Some emperors lasted just a few months. Then some local regions start breaking away too. Around 260, Rome splits into also three parts. West, you got Gaul. East, you got Syria. And in the middle, Italy, the real Roman Empire. So at this point, it looks like both have weak emperors, both fall into chaos. But the real issue is the system itself stopped working. Whoever sits on the throne has to rely on someone else, eunuchs, relatives, or generals. Now, of course, it's not exactly the same. Han Dynasty fully collapsed around 220 AD. Rome doesn't disappear at that time. Alright, let's keep going. On the Chinese side, the Three Kingdoms finally come to an end in 280, and China reunifies under the Jin Dynasty. The man who makes that happen is Sima Yan, Emperor Wu. Alright, there are so many Emperor Wu in ancient China. This guy is not that famous Emperor Wu of Han Dynasty. Since the Sima family rose to power by replacing the Cao family of Wei, then Sima Yan makes a decision. He hands out massive amounts of land and power to members of his own clan. The idea is simple: keep power within the family. However, it creates an exactly opposite result. After Sima Yan dies, the throne goes to Sima Zhong, who is not exactly capable of ruling, or literally stupid. There is a famous story about him. During a famine, people told him the population had nothing to eat, and he just said, then why don't they eat meat porridge? So real power ends up in the hands of Jia Nanfeng, his ambitious emperors. And from there, things spiral fast. The Sima princes, Sima Zhong's uncles and cousins, and even one of younger brother of his grandpa, who is still alive, still stood out and started fighting each other. How many? Totally 8. The War of 8 Princes. Notorious. They all trying to seize supreme power, years of civil wars, and the empire is completely drained. Some of these princes started relying on barbarian groups inside the empire as mercenaries. One more thing, in China, the major population has always been Han Chinese, and just like the Romans called those barbarian groups Germanics, the Han Chinese has their own term, Hu, to describe these northern peoples. At first, the Hu are just helpers, but once the central government weakens enough, they stop being helpers and start taking power themselves. Then everything collapsed. In 316, Luoyang and Chang'an, the capitals, are sacked. The Jin dynasty, or we can say the Western Jin dynasty, is gone. Okay, also West and East. Now let's look at Rome. Around 270, Raleigh managed to reunify the empire, the restorer of the world, right? But the core problems still there. Soon after, he is assassinated, and Rome falls back into chaos. Then comes another key figure we all know, Diocletian. 4 rulers, right? Sharing power across the empire. At first, it actually works, but the moment Diocletian steps down, everything falls apart. Different factions stop following the system. The army, regional powers, and even formal rulers, everyone starts competing for control. Suddenly, multiple emperors appear. How many? Also 8. Everyone is fighting. The winner? Constantine the Great. He reunifies the Roman Empire again. However, after he dies, the empire becomes unstable again. A few decades later, Rome officially splits into 2, East and West. For the West, the army becomes more and more dependent on barbarian mercenaries. Sounds familiar, right? And eventually, those mercenaries become the real power. In 410, Rome itself is sacked, and finally, in 476, the Western Roman Empire falls. Okay, welcome to the world of fragmentation. In Rome, we have eastern half now, still calls itself the Roman Empire. But in China, the story plays out a little differently. After the fall of Western Jin, a member of the Sima family, Sima Rui, leaves the old capital and sets up a new court in Nanjing. Since Nanjing lies in the east of Luoyang, this new region is called the Eastern Jin, still calls itself the Jin dynasty. And this isn't just a political move. You have massive migration and huge waves of refugees, all moving from the north to the south. Well, who controls the north now? Who regimes? And how many major groups we are talking about? 5. Xiongnu, Xianbei, Jie, Di, and Qiang. Now look at Rome. The center of gravity shifts east, from Rome to Constantinople. So just like China, now you have a new political center in the east. But what about the western lands? They get taken over by different Germanic groups. How many? Also 5. The Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Franks, and the Suebi. Then, in the Eastern Jin and Eastern Rome, as these leftover regimes struggled on, there were also some strong leaders trying to fix things. In China, we have Liu Yu, a near unstoppable general who eventually becomes emperor. The kind of guy people said could take it on hundreds by himself. He campaigns north and briefly retakes Luoyang and Chang'an. In Rome, we have Emperor Justinian I and his general Belisarius. They fight their way back into Rome and even reclaim much of Italy for a time. So at that moment, both sides are trying to rebuild a lost empire, but both attempts fail in the end. At this point, the two sides still look pretty similar. On one side, in the northern China, you have these so-called Hu regimes. On the other side, in Western Europe, you have all these barbarian kingdoms, and interestingly, they are both doing the same thing, learning from the civilizations they replaced. Chinese culture, Roman law. But here is where things start to change. What they actually want to do is no longer the same. In China, most of these rulers share one clear goal: to reunify the entire realm. The best example is Fujian, a Di tribesman, the ruler of former Qin. It's called formal Qin to distinguish it from the earlier Qin dynasty of the Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the man who unified China for the first time in 221 BC. Although as a barbarian ruler, Fujian always wants to be another Emperor Qin Shi Huang. He manages to unify almost all of the northern China. At one point, he's just one step away from reunifying the whole country. But then, he loses at the Battle of Fei River, 淝水之战, a really famous battle in Chinese history. After the defeat, the North collapsed into division again. However, the goal of reunification was always there. Now look at the Roman side. Clovis I unifies most of Gaul. Theodoric the Great controls Italy. They are successful, but what they are trying to build is not a restored Roman Empire, instead their own kingdoms. No one is saying, I'm going to rebuild Rome, and that is the first real divergence. And now the gap starts getting bigger. In northern China, even though these regimes are ruled by non-Han elite, there is one key reality. The majority of the population is still Han Chinese, and resistance exists, really strong resistance. For example, after years of oppression of Han population by barbarian groups, Ranming, a Han general, issued an order called Kill the Hu, literally kill the Hu people, encouraging civilians to carry out indiscriminate attacks against the Hu people. Now today, this figure is controversial. Some Han Chinese people even praise him as a nationalist hero, but in reality, he was also extremely brutal. But the point is, this tells these barbarian rulers something important. If you want to rule this land, you have to rule it the Chinese way. So what do you see? Large numbers of Han officials enter the core of government. The Han Chinese statesmen like Wang Meng became the chancellor of Fujian, a day ruler, and Cui Hao, also Han Chinese, became the chief advisor of Tuo Batao, the Xianbei ruler. But the real turning point comes later, within the Northern Wei. In the late 5th century, under Emperors Dowager Feng and Emperor Xiaowen, the Xianbei rulers, a series of radical reforms take place. They moved the capital south from Datong to Luoyang, changed their surname. Even Emperor Xiaowen himself changed his name from Tuo Bahong to Yuan Hong, Yuan as a Chinese character. And he also forced intermarriage between Xianbei nobles with Han elites. At this point, this is no longer just learning, this is full integration. In fact, from that point on, these so-called barbarian groups gradually merged into the Han Chinese population. Over time, they disappeared as separate identities. And from then on, the Han Chinese people themselves are also no longer exactly what they used to be. Now, look at the Western world. Things are different. I'm not sure whether there are large-scale resistance from Roman populations or massive integration of Romans into barbarian ruling elites. For these barbarian rulers, they use Roman system, but they don't become Romans. Now, I'm not saying this is absolute. If you know more, please feel free to drop it in the comments. By the 6th century, China finally finds a path back to unity. In the north, after long periods of war, Yuan clan, or the Xianbei leaders, took power from the Tuoba or the Yuan family, founded the northern Zhou, and eventually unified northern China. Then, a noble from the northern Zhou, Yang Jian, a Han Chinese general, or at least that's what he claimed to be, takes power, founds the Sui dynasty, and eventually conquers the south. China is unified again. Now what about Rome? Nothing like this happens. Charlemagne the Great managed to unify much of the Western Europe, but seemed like he never really tried to take over the Eastern Roman Empire. And after his death, his empire was quickly divided again among his heirs. So by now, you can probably see why China reunified and Rome didn't. Let me break it down into 3 points. First, different goals. In China, no matter who is in power, no matter Han or non-Han, the ultimate goal is reunification. In the Roman world, barbarian rulers aim for their own kingdoms. Second, different foundations. China has a dominant population, a shared rating system, a long-standing bureaucratic tradition. Whoever rules has to fit into that system. In the Roman world, Roman identity weakens over time, and barbarian rulers don't fully adopt it. Third, different levels of commitment. China produced rulers like Emperor Xiaowen, who completely transformed themselves, with no way back. In the Western world, leaders borrow from Rome, but never fully become Roman. So, when you look back at the whole story, same chaos, different ending, same kind of collapse, completely different outcome. That's pretty much the story of China and Rome from the late 2nd to the 6th century. In the end, here's the real question. Why did China keep moving toward unity? while Rome stopped trying? Was it culture, geography, political structure? Okay, that's what we are diving into next. This is our story about China and Rome. Thanks for your watching. If you like this video, if you want more about Chinese history, about comparisons between Eastern and Western events and figures, let me know in the comments. See you next time.